Hello, welcome to Lesson 11, Social Studies with Mr. Appel. Today we're going to talk about the era right after George Washington finally retired and left the scene. He had been president for 8 years, but it was time in 1796 for a new election, and he went into retirement. And the election of 1796 featured Thomas Jefferson, who is now on the nickel. The election of 1796 was the first election where two people were actually going head-to-head because George Washington had been unchallenged. This election featured two new political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists believed in a strong federal government, and they wanted a national bank, and they tended to be pro-British. The Democratic Republicans did not believe in a national bank. They believed that states should have more power, and they were more pro-French. Also, when it came to slavery, since Federalists were mostly from the North, they were not as big on slavery as the Democratic Republicans were, who were mostly from the South and what they called the West back then. Well, the election was extremely close, and John Adams defeated Thomas Jefferson 71 to 68 in electoral votes. But because of the system, whoever came in second place back then became the vice president. So Adams was the president, and Jefferson was the vice president, even though they didn't like each other at all. Well, Adams had 4 years as president. He was the first president to only win once. And most of his time was taken up with the issues surrounding France and England. As we talked about earlier, France had had a revolutionary war. France was in chaos. France was fighting against England and other countries. And we were caught in the middle of it because our trade was being disrupted. French Navy and English Navy were really messing up our ships. So Adams thought it would be a good idea to send over some diplomats, people to talk out problems, right? So he picked three very good politicians that he knew, diplomats: John Marshall, Elbridge Gerry, and C.C. Pinckney, three Federalists, and he sent them over to France to go talk to France. But the French, instead of welcoming them and sitting down and talking out the problems, the French sent three agents named X, Y, and Z. That was their code names. And they demanded that the Americans give them a lot of money before anything else happened. That was considered an insult to the Americans. And soon after, a war broke out called the Quasi-War, which was American ships fighting against French ships. And that lasted for 2 years. Since things were so chaotic, John Adams and the Federalists decided we need to make things a little bit more safe and secure in the United States. So the House and the Senate passed these laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. What does that mean? Well, an alien is an illegal immigrant. So John Adams wanted to get rid of people who were in the United States illegally, who were criticizing him or perhaps were helping France. So the Alien Act made it easier for John Adams to get those people out of America. They can get arrested and deported, sent back to France or wherever else they came from. The Sedition Act said it's now a crime to criticize the federal government. Although we all learned about the First Amendment, which says you are allowed to criticize. Well, John Adams and the Federalists said, not right now. This is too serious. So it became a crime to criticize the government. And a lot of Democratic Republicans were arrested and put in jail because they were criticizing John Adams. And the final thing on this card said Convention of 1800. Well, that's when the U.S. and France did finally agree to stop fighting with the Navy ships. So 1800, therefore, was going to be a very heated election. Because on the one hand, you had the Federalists who were saying, England is the better country. We need a strong national bank. And we're from the North, mostly. And we're not too big on slavery. On the other hand, you had the Democratic Republicans who were saying, you took away our freedom of speech. You're fighting against France, the country that we love. You're taking away states' rights. We don't like your bank. And we basically do like slavery. So these two sides really didn't like each other. and the election of 1800 was very heated. Well, as I said earlier, the system was not really thought out very well when they made the Constitution, because each state had electors. Electors are the people who put the votes in, the electoral votes. And electors got to pick two people that they wanted. Well, the Federalist electors, they picked John Adams first, and they picked C.C. Pinckney second, and they left one of those choices for John Jay so that they wouldn't be tied, you see? So if the Federalists had won, Adams would have been the president, and C.C. Pinckney would have been the vice president. On the Democratic-Republican side, they didn't figure that out. They all voted for their top two choices, which was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. But since they all voted for their top two choices, they ended up tied, 73-73. Not good. By the way, after this election, they fixed this by putting in the 12th Amendment. So you vote for vice president and president, and they're two totally separate things. But back then, they weren't two totally separate things. You voted for your top two choices, and they ended up in a tie. Now what happens? Well, since the election of 1800 ended in a tie, it was up to the House of Representatives to pick the winner. Now, back then, the House of Representatives, there was only 16 states. So the way it worked was every state's members in the House of Reps voted. So let's say your state had 10 members. If the vote was 5-5, then your state didn't count. If your vote was 6-4 for Jefferson, then your state would go to Jefferson. If it was 6-4 for Aaron Burr, it would count as Aaron Burr's state. And since there were 16 states back then, you needed to get more than half. So you needed 9 or more states. Well, the House of Representatives, when this vote took place in 1801, a few months after the election, was actually controlled by Federalists. The Federalists had more members. And they didn't like Jefferson or Burr. So it just kept going on, and they voted 35 straight times, and nobody got 9 states. Now, as the story goes, one of the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, wrote a letter to a bunch of the other Federalist members in the House of Reps, telling them, look, I don't like either one of these two people, Jefferson or Burr, but at least Jefferson is a decent politician, and he has morals. He said, Aaron Burr, we can't have him as a president. He's a scoundrel. You can't trust him. Well, the message was given, and the Federalists listened to Hamilton because he was their leader, basically. And on the 36th vote, finally, Thomas Jefferson did get 9 states. So he became the president, and Aaron Burr became the vice president. And that ended the election of 1800. It was the first time that power had gone from one party, the Federalists, to another party, the Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson got rid of a lot of John Adams' laws. Some of the students asked me, can a president come in and change things that the old presidents did? Sometimes he can, yes. So Jefferson got rid of the Sedition Act, and he got rid of some of the Alien Acts. And he said in his speech when he became president, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. We have to act united. So that's how the election of 1800 ended. Jefferson became the first Democratic Republican president. Burr, by the way, ended up killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel 3 years later in 1804. That's another lesson in another day. But the takeaways here, the election went peacefully. That's why they call it the Revolution of 1800, because power went from one party to another party peacefully. No one got hurt. And it was the first time that we had ever had a tie vote. And that's why they had to change the Constitution also in 1804. So that wouldn't happen ever again, where you get the second place becoming the vice president. I hope you all are feeling well. I know it's not fun being quarantined or shelter in place or whatever it is, but I hope you are learning a lot. I certainly am, in all the research that I'm doing for these lessons. If you have any questions or comments, post them below. Be safe. Enjoy your holidays, those that celebrate.